Welcome to the Big Four Accounting Firms podcast, brought to you by big4accountingfirms.com. In today's podcast, I wanted to discuss more news of the PwC tax leak scandal because there's just more and more information that comes out of this, and none of it is good. There's news that's come out that the head of the reputation or public relations, PwC Australia, has quit. His name was Rory Grant, and he was calling it quits. Apparently, he's been there for 3 years, and he didn't want to deal with the situation. Which I don't blame him. But also, if you're in public relations, like what else? What else are you supposed to do? Not what else are you supposed to do, but like what is your job for? You're only there for the good times. You could tell that guy was just a 9 to 5er because this is one of the biggest scandals ever, and you could really build up your reputation. And like, let's say you can't revitalize PwC's brand right now in the short term. Well, as long as you're willing to stick with the firm in that role, I think you could probably negotiate for, just about as big a salary as you want. And plus, public relations, you're supposed to help improve the firm's brand. And so now you're just going to dodge out at the firm's toughest time and, trying to get a new gig. I mean, maybe this guy already has a good resume, but you're trying to go to a new company and you've just showed them that you'll quit the second a scandal starts. Now, this is a crazy scandal. I actually don't think it's that big of a scandal as Australia is making it out to seem. But the problem is you're going against the government, and you're going against the government's form of revenue, like their collection of revenue, and you were scheming around how to cut off their revenue. And not in the normal way the big four accounting firms do, which is like tax consulting, but just actually leaking legislation, which again, I still don't think is that big of a deal. I think it's just a bigger deal in Australia because this happens all the time around the world. Like tax consultants are very embedded in the government because a lot of them either, have worked in the government or a lot of them have worked in the government and they know everybody in the government. So because a lot of these administrations, they have to appoint people. And when they appoint people, they usually appoint them out of the big four accounting firms. And then once a new administration comes in and changes, they go back to the big four accounting firms. But apparently in Australia, this is something new. I think just the way this guy did it, like where the problem here is the Collins guy was actually on an engagement with the government helping them. And while he was helping them, he was like giving the information out the back door. That's the problem. But like what actually happened here is nothing new. Is nothing new in my eyes. It's just the way the guy did it was very unethical, and that's what's happened here. But so the public relations guy, it's gone the way of the dodo, and then PwC's also hired a disaster management attorney and her firm, Sue Cato, and she's handled some like crazy public relations cases. So hopefully she can help. The problem is like this involves the government in Australia. The government is out for blood here. So PwC is in trouble. And the other problem that I foresee here that people I haven't really seen written up is PwC screwed over the government. And so if you're a large corporation in Australia, or in a lot of places actually, because this wasn't just Australia tax, it was like global taxation. It's where these governments conspire to come up with this, this multi-country global taxation plan where you can't hide your, interest payments across borders and stuff like that. So if you're a large corporation and you're trying to hire a tax consultant to help you with your tax compliance or tax planning, it's a higher risk now that you have PwC, because if a country or a country's taxing authority sees PwC on the signature line, your audit risk just went up. whether that's legal or not, like countries are going to be doing that. And to think that corporations aren't thinking of that right now is very, very naive. And also, when PwC goes into negotiations for tax work, I believe this is going to come up. And if they do choose to use PwC, they're going to get a hefty discount. So PwC Australia's revenues for the next few years are going to not be so good. And that's the other thing with this public relations guy. Like, the guy probably only had to stick around a few more years, and all this is gonna go away, just because of the way the big four are just embedded in every country and large corporation. Now, I mean, Australia could try and do away with PwC. Maybe they will, but I don't think that's the right answer. But we'll see, because they're definitely turning up the heat on them. And another evidence of them turning up the heat on PwC in Australia is that PwC Australia disclosed names of four partners, four former partners. I guess they're retired and getting their pensions now, who are also on some of these leaked emails, and they released that to the Australian legislators. But the Australian legislators are like, "Hey, don't give it to just us. Release it publicly and let people know who these people are, just to restore public faith," or whatever. As if, I don't get, I don't understand that, right? It's like, you have to, let's just destroy everybody's lives because they they potentially took some money away from the government. But I mean, that's just evidence there of how the government wants to do that. It's like, let's convict these people in the public square, with no defense. And that's what the Australian government is doing, and that's the path they're on. And you have to remember, they're also doing a criminal investigation into PwC. And I think really that's where a whole number of issues can come up. There's a whole number of paths, and that's kind of the way that in the U.S. that the Department of Justice did away with Arthur Anderson. They gave them basically the death penalty there, and it was reversed by the Supreme Court later on. But I think it's these criminal probes where the real damage can be done. But also, it's also the way where you can, I think, address the bad apples and address behavior in the future. Because if you target it towards the people that knew all the facts and still proceeded, then, and you actually give them criminal penalties, then I think you can prevent this from happening in the future. I think that's the way that should be done. And also PwC, that's the way they're going to also get out of this mess. They have to discipline people, but discipline them the right way. Like, if they know everything that's happened already, and they're not penalizing people, and they're waiting on the government to do that, that's not going to end well for them, because it's going to show that it's just partners looking out for other partners. And in the face of unethical behavior, if it's partners just looking out for each other, that's not going to end well for the firm, because it's going to show no matter what level of fraud or unethical behavior, they're more worried about their fellow partners and their pay. And another issue that's going to come off of this is recruiting at PwC, because you're not going to want to work for a firm that's in the headlines as like one of the most corrupt companies in the country. And the implications globally too for PwC, they have to think through all of this. They obviously didn't think through it before, because this thing is blowing up bigger than anybody would have thought. And you're having partners quit and fired left and right, and it's just becoming a mess. But the other thing you can't do is just destroy your firm to appease the government, because right now this government is not going to be appeased with a lot of things. But you have to do what's right and be able to justify it and be able to live with that. And that's going to be the other thing. And then at some point too, you're going to have to be willing to push back on the government on a lot of this stuff. Like, if you fire the people that you think were involved, the problem is if it's systemic, but we'll have to figure out whether that's true or not. Tim Ryan's going to have to get off his high horse of being the the most ESG CEO on the planet, and he's going to actually, unfortunately, he did not do so well on the S and the G of the ESG. So he's going to have to get off his high horse as the most ESG and diverse guy out there to actually explain how his firm is ethical and all this. Now I understand Tim Ryan's in the US, but I think he's been involved in this because the US is implicated in this. And he's going to be having to explain to recruits and his partners how they're going to overcome this, how they pitch this to clients. And I'm just saying him because he's like the most out there on social media, um, just on his high horse. And same thing with the other big four accounting firms as far as being on their high horses, like KPMG and Deloitte. I'm sure they have skeletons in their closet as well. I mean, KPMG, we know because it's, pretty much every month something comes out about them. So it's just like the big four accounting firms are going to have to look at the way they do business and make sure this isn't happening. They're going to have to. We see this with KPMG in South Africa and Africa in general. There's a lot of scandals with KPMG there. There's a lot of this around the world, but the Australian one has big implications for PwC. So the big four accounting firms are going to have to look at their books of business, see where they do work with the government, and consider the risks and reward. Because another thing too is like, is this worth it? You have to think a lot of times the type of work you're doing with the government and whether it's worth it. Because things like this happen and leaks like this happen. You don't really want that to happen. And tax consulting projects also. You see here, this is tax collection because these governments during COVID gained a lot of power. And they are grabbing that power and utilizing it and multiplying it now post pandemic. So you have to think of projects like this where you work for the government or you're working on a tax project for a client, a corporation to avoid taxes. And you have to think of whether, a couple $1 million is worth the headline liability of going against the government. Because you see here when you do something against the government, people say you've acted against the public or you've ruined public trust. And that sounds a lot worse than, what typically happens with the big four where they sign off on an account that they shouldn't have that went under shortly after that. So the implications here are big, and PwC and the big four have to analyze engagements on the amount of revenue versus risk. And for a tax consulting type of project, what I would say is like, if you've come up with this cute structure that saves clients hundreds of millions of dollars, which is typically how projects are sold, but you're only collecting a couple million or a few 100,000, is that really worth it? Like, you have to measure that scale and you have to measure on like how insecure that tax position is. And I think a lot more of that should be done. Will it be done? I don't know. Because I think what happened here is people got into the mode of doing the same as last year and everybody else is doing it, because this guy who definitely did not come up with this approach by himself. Like, he'd seen other partners do this. I guarantee you that, based on my experience in accounting and the big four accounting firms. I guarantee you this guy had seen other people do this in some form or fashion. Not necessarily where they had an engagement with the government, but somebody that was working inside of the government and giving information to PwC, because that is very common. And so he was just doing the same as usual. So I don't think this is uncommon, but the big four have to elevate their perspective above that and start assessing risk over that could destroy their firm. So that's the news for PwC, and the implications there keep growing and growing. And the headlines and articles that are being printed about PwC reflect that. So we'll make sure to keep an eye on that for you. So make sure to subscribe to this podcast and check out the show notes for useful links. Thanks for listening.